born in New York City in 1964 and has spent his entire life living in New York. He graduated with his BFA in painting from SUNY Purchase in 1986 and attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture that same year. He's been exhibiting since 1992 at various New York galleries, including Tibor De Nagy Gallery and Caren in Fine Art, as well as at the Gregory Lind Gallery, which is here in San Francisco. His most recent exhibition was at Tibor De Nagy in last May, and he is also showing his 2005 cardboard installation, Full Stop, at the McNay Museum in San Antonio, Texas, which is still up for another month or so, and which is then going to travel to Knoxville, Tennessee, to the Knoxville Museum of Art. And he currently has a show at Gregory Lind, a solo show opening on Thursday, so you all should go see his show, go to the opening, and what am I missing? I think that's it. Okay, so yeah, please help me welcome Tom to CCA.
So I think I should explain a couple things first off the bat, which is that I'm going to try and show stuff that kind of starts a little bit when I got out of school, because I think that's really informative for students, and then move quickly through to the present, hopefully. Something that's important to know is that both my parents are artists, and so I grew up in New York City, kind of around their friends a bit, and so I had a very particular idea of what it meant to be an artist, which I realize now has influenced the way I think in mostly good ways and a couple of maybe not so good ways in a way, but mostly good in the sense that when I was in school, just the sense that I had this very foundational idea that being an artist was actually really just a job in a way, and was just you went and you worked hard, and it wasn't wrapped up in a lot of particularly glamorous things necessarily. And I think a lot of my peers that were in school, they were getting their information from, we only had art magazines at the time, no internet, so they might have been getting all this kind of rather glamorous idea of what it meant to be an artist, or those very peculiar, strange, old mythological ideas of the kind of the romance of being an artist or stuff like that. So I felt very privileged that I had a very kind of what I thought of as a normal idea of being an artist. So this is my senior show at SUNY Purchase, and I'm not going to say too much about that. It's just, I was just really kind of getting my feet wet, and kind of, I think one thing that carries over through till today is just this sense of trying to make the paintings very physicalized and very kind of somehow connected to more of a real world than the window idea of canvas and oil paint, which is a thing that only exists in the art world to some extent. So I was using a lot of enamel paint. This is when I went to Skowhegan. I was using a lot of enamel paint just for its, again, it's kind of non-art associations. And I was using a lot of these kind of letter forms. I realized in college and at Skowhegan that, I was in this very particular academic bubble and in an institution, there are motivational factors for making artwork that don't exist in the somewhat wider world. And they are the fact that, you or your parents are paying a lot of money for you to make this stuff, ultimately, that you are getting evaluated and graded on it, and you are trying to pass, based on that. You have your peers and your faculty that are looking at it and kind of giving you approval. So you have this kind of particular kind of audience that's different from the other situations that art exists in terms of being seen. And I really enjoyed that, and I think I did okay in that environment, but I realized that it was very kind of time limited for me, and I was going to be coming out of that. I realized that when I was showing my work and critiques, I would talk about all this stuff, and I could discuss it intelligently, but I had a kind of a bit of an epiphany at some point when I realized that none of those things was anything I ever actually really thought of in my mind when I was making the work. It was a dissection of it. It was a terrific skill to learn, but it was a parallel track that didn't really actually feel like it was quite the core of making the work. And I think that comes from a lot of like maybe anti-literalist tendencies I have all throughout my work, but and a belief that my process is what drives everything forward, not really a conceptual foregrounding of something that pulls the work behind it, so to speak. So I moved, I grew up in New York, so I moved back to New York after my BFA, and was kind of waiting to figure out if I was going to go to grad school, and I kind of just kept waiting. I couldn't figure out a place to go. I moved back to New York to a very good situation, which was that I had this terrific job working for this artist, Red Grooms, as his assistant, which I completely loved. He's like an incredibly wonderful, generous mentor to me, and a fantastic example, which is not that our work looks anything alike, but his kind of generosity of spirit and how to be an artist and not become like embittered, which is definitely a problem among a lot of artists, has something I would hope to model on, definitely. And his complete energy and motivational juice to kind of go ahead and do something before it really got put on the table as a very particularly good idea in terms of logic or conceptual basis or anything like that is another example. I think it's just like, I love the way that he would just kind of just make it like in a very almost innocent kind of way, that energy to make something the way, you know, kind of we probably all were as artists at one point before we had to involve a lot of language in the whole process. So instead of going to grad school, what I did with my earnings from this job is that I would often go traveling instead. So I felt for the time being it was kind of my alternative to grad school. So I would spend a lot of time traveling through East and Southeast Asia, looking at a lot of things that I found incredibly interesting. And this painting reminds me of an example where I was in Thailand and just looking at a sign that was, I think it was advertising tires or something, but it was incredibly painted. And I got so kind of jazzed by the beauty of it. And I felt this kind of weird sense of the fact that, but it's not doing what it's supposed to do. It's off message. If I'm appreciating it on my terms, it's not telling me that they sell tires there. But how come I'm so completely enthralled with this quality that it has, and the kind of directness that like signage has, the lack of the kind of baggage and pretension that art has, that those signs had. And I felt like that maybe that was a bit of a model for me to make artwork on, in the sense that there I am in this other place, and there's a lot of contextual things that I can understand and relate to, like human commonality certainly, but there's something about communication that's being missed on me, and loving that kind of slippage of that kind of communication thing. And I'm kind of like forced to kind of drop my bags of meaning and just let the kind of something about the beauty of it wash over me as a tourist or something like that. And I started thinking that when I wanted to make paintings when I got back, that they had something in that quality that hopefully the viewer would come to them, and there might be some potential barriers of them trying to figure out the meaning of them, but that there would be some sort of spirit of generosity in the work that would kind of swamp and overwhelm that kind of those requirements that people might have, and could just kind of project forward and find some sort of acceptance outside of language, logic, things like that, kind of like nonsense things. So I was making all these paintings are enamel. A lot of them are very small. I was just making lots of little ones. I felt like this tremendous energy to kind of just keep dashing off work and not worrying very much about what it all meant, in a sense. I just had that kind of energy. And I kept thinking, well, I'm really going to have to kind of either go to grad school and kind of, find some way of like narrowing this thing and framing it, or I'm going to have to just myself sit down with like a legal pad and write out 20 pages of what I'm really after. And I never did that. So I thought, okay, that either means that I'm very lazy in terms of trying to deal with things I'm thinking about, or it didn't feel like it was actually that crucial as I kind of thought it. I was making myself think it was crucial. But I felt like I could keep on working even without that. And I don't know if I had various questions about whether I was kind of going just in circles within my own self in a way and needed some sort of outward framing, outward kind of information. But I had a lot of great friends from Skowhegan that were very high caliber people and artists, and could talk to them about it. So I had that kind of peer group that a grad school might give you. I had this job that I loved. I could work there and still find the motivation to make work of my own, even while I was helping this artist make his work. I had a reasonable place to live in at the time and a space to work at in New York City. I didn't think I really believed in the idea of teaching art anyway, so I didn't think that getting the graduate degree would be something that would be kind of actually right for me. And maybe because I had those artist parents, I had a little more of a foreground of some ideas of stuff as opposed to my peers in undergrad school that were kind of just getting started by the time they graduated. I felt like I maybe had a little bit of a leg up somehow in terms of what to do. And I just wanted to be out from under those institutional bubbles of like why you make work. Like I said, that motivation to make work is kind of baked into the whole process of being in an institution, and I was really eager to get out and just kind of find my own meaning of it. So I just never went to grad school. It just never kind of happened. I never found a place that I wanted to go to as much as my undergraduate institution. So I just never went, and I don't think I really regret that. I think that sometimes I wish I had, but that's the way it worked out. I was looking at a lot of work from around the world, like I said earlier, in Thailand, and kind of throwing all these things in this kind of collagist sense, just kind of tossing things together and making them kind of feel like a fait accompli in terms of the image making, where again there was this kind of awkward friction between things, the way collage can have, where something is kind of ripped out of context or cut out of context and dropped on something else. And I really liked that kind of quality that it had. And I just, hopefully it's kind of just, in a way, the work kind of demonstrates a very basic thing, which is that I'm really enjoying making this work, that there's a real kind of flush of kind of experience and love of doing it that is almost like the most important kind of, let's call it an attitude, not content, but an attitude that kind of comes off the work as a radiating feature almost, a kind of a, I was very distrustful of a lot of work I see that is very withholding, let's say, that it requires you to kind of have a lot of prior knowledge, having done a lot of reading, read the wall label, that kind of for me was about like kind of a little bit of a velvet rope in front of the work, a la, clubs that have the velvet rope. And once you're let in, you feel very embraced by having made it past that point, but it's an elitist kind of, situation in a way. So I wanted to try and find a way to make work that I felt was, I don't think populist is the right word, but would feel like it has a kind of a spirit of optimism and generosity that would kind of come out to meet you, kind of extending its hand to shake your hand rather than waiting for you to come to it somehow. I was kind of starting to paint in a lot of these imagery that I got from catalogs of stuff. Like I love the way those kind of things are photographed in those catalogs with that kind of particular way it's lit and stuff like that. And I think I'm starting to have this interest in kind of taking these representational things and find a way to kind of bleed them of their context, bleed them of some of their meaning, and make them feel like they're much more in an abstract world, and then find a way to kind of concretize and make physicalize the abstract thing so that they feel more like they are living in the world. I always kind of dislike that sense of abstraction where it feels like it's not really quite of the world somehow. I love abstraction, but it's got a pitfall for me of not feeling like it's participating in the world. It's participating in its own kind of hermetic world. So I think I'm trying to mess that up, basically. I'm trying to hybridize it, make it less pure. I don't like pure things. I want to make them kind of more mixed up or something like that. Less streamlined conceptually, ideologically, dogmatically, kind of things like that. So at this point, let's see, what year? This is like 1994 or 5, and I had done a trip to India where I had kind of, one of the few times where when I wasn't painting, I would think about things that I wanted to do. All the work I showed before, I'm not thinking about anything I want to do. It's kind of happening. And then I can kind of have some perspective on it sometimes years later. Like a lot of the stuff I'm talking about that I think that some of the work is about is nothing that occurred to me at the time. It's something that I've kind of self-diagnosed several years afterwards in process of doing things like this, talking about my work. But I didn't recognize it as such in the studio at the time I was making that work. I can kind of see it now in retrospect. But there was this one thing where I was like, okay, I really want to try and make my work a little bigger, find some way to inject a little more a little bit more ambition without the ambition having a capital A to it, which again, I was distrustful of that kind of heroic painting idea that maybe the New York school thing has. So I started to kind of make them a little bit bigger. So these are getting like more like 4 feet tall instead of 12 inches tall, which is most of the stuff I showed previously. Just kind of throwing all sorts of things in there, kind of perversely liking that sense of it being nonsense and kind of, kind of texturally kind of just screwed up somehow. These are all still enamel paint. I really like that quality that it had of being not quite an art material. It felt like it was something that I could really possess as my own, as a material. And oil paint on canvas didn't feel like the thing for me somehow. Felt too kind of the, art making world. I'm not fooling myself. I'm trying to make art for sure, but kind of there was something about this enamel paint, its relation to signs. I love the way it could it has this very particular colors that are of its own, that are not the same as the palette that you get from oil paint, for instance. You can make these very fluid, improvisational paintings that because of the enamel, it has this incredible edge to it, like where the edges end, that always looks incredibly kind of sharp and kind of like almost like pop. And it feels like it imbues a little more confidence and self-possession into a very intuitive improvisational method that I actually had. And all these paintings have loads of paintings underneath them. I'm just kind of starting in some very general place, working them through into all sorts of kind of iterations. They're getting turned around. And I don't know what I'm after, and I don't know how to describe when they're done in a general sense. Usually it's like I feel that they have gotten to some place where they're only done because I don't do anything more on them, in the sense. Like I don't want to know when I'm doing that last thing. If my hand knows that, it feels really creepy to me, and it feels really like prideful somehow. And I do things when I think I'm knowing that are kind of too clever or too, and like I want it to feel like it's more the momentum of the thing is continuing to rush forward, and that it still feels like very open surface in a way. And the enamel is great because it's always kind of potentially the same. You don't have to kind of scrape it down and make it thinner or make it thicker. It's always kind of the same thing. So I could work on them for years and they wouldn't really get built up in a way. And then I could do one thing that is usually a bit of a left turn, or I don't know what I'm doing, and I discover it only when I've done it, and then I don't touch it anymore. And so that kind of sense of kind of curious discovery hopefully is what I don't know about other people, but that's what I still see in the paintings as that's what's the good part about them, is just they feel like they've discovered something right at that moment, and it still feels like it's up on the surface of the painting for me and hopefully for others. So I started kind of sticking this little figure of myself in there, kind of as a continuation of some of those figurative elements that were in the other works. I had taken about 6 months off and built a house up in Maine for a while. So that idea of me and my little work belt, kind of lugging these parts of this abstract painting around as if I was like following a blueprint, and that it was much more of a kind of like a blue collar kind of way of making a painting, potentially, like rather than kind of, this intellectual, high experience of how do you construct an abstract painting in the ivory tower of the art realm. I wanted to kind of posit this idea that it could be like a worker guy kind of, just lifting this stuff into place. It makes fun of painting a little bit, and I think that's something that I've always been interested in. It has some sort of sense of humor to it, I think, that is also a crucial thing for me. Abstract art doesn't have enough humor in it often, because where do you actually put it, right? But making these paintings was rather difficult for me in a lot of ways. There was something about getting the tenor of the figures right that was harder. I mean, I reflected back on when I was a painter. By this point, I'd been painting for maybe 20 years, and I remember when I was really young how easy making paintings were, even if I look back on them and they weren't terribly good, but the self-confidence of youth and the kind of way of being able to just kind of go ahead and do something was getting a little harder as I was getting a little older. And so these paintings were a little more of a struggle. I felt like I had to struggle with them to make the paintings I wanted to, but I always wanted to really enjoy myself, and I was having a little bit less of that. So I started thinking about how these things were getting harder, and as you get to be an older painter, that there are these kind of moments where you, or any age, where you kind of like start wondering, like, am I really going to do this for the rest of my life? What if I don't know how to go forward? And I didn't feel that when I was younger. I felt like I could just kind of go right ahead and storm my way through it. It was for me anyway. It wasn't really for an audience. I just had to satisfy myself. And things got a little kind of harder for me at this point in that sense. I was showing at this point, so maybe that's another pressure or something about how, you know that there actually is going to be someone seeing it eventually, as opposed to when I was younger. I didn't intend to show it to anyone, really. I kind of was thinking about the sense of what if you really run into that kind of wall as an artist. And I didn't really feel like I was going to have that problem, but I started really thinking about it a lot, kind of somehow outside of myself. And I started thinking that I wanted to do something very different than painting, which is so kind of polite. I wanted to do a different project, and this was the project I did. I started making all these things for a studio out of cardboard, and I wanted to do this installation piece that you would walk into that would be, so cardboard was just such crappy stuff. I loved that compared to kind of art making materials. I wanted it to have this sense that you would walk into it and it would have this incredible amount of information buzzing around you. Every little surface would be kind of inflected with this black paint, and that at the center would be this kind of blank canvas that was this kind of rather under the radar narrative about an artist who didn't know how to go any further, or perhaps they're at that point of making some sort of decision. So it's kind of like presenting an existential moment that is, I half believe that that's a serious thing for artists to kind of deal with that thing, but it's also kind of like making fun of it, because being an artist is really quite a privilege, I think. And, it's kind of like, having those kind of first world problems, let's say, that kind of idea of like, oh, what do I do? Like, other people have some more serious problems than that somehow. So I think that's the kind of tension with painting that I kind of like. So I wanted to kind of tell this story that was kind of a little pathetic maybe about someone who doesn't know how to go forward. It's a little bit of a memorial to all those artists who spend their whole life making work. There's plenty of artists, or there's some artists that we know of that have spent their life making artwork, and it's made the canon. It's in museums. It's like valued. It's carefully tucked away in beautiful crates in climate-controlled places. But there's 99% of the other artists that have spent their whole life making work, and it's just as important to them as that de Kooning is to de Kooning, and they spend their whole life making this work, and maybe they have a little bit of a success, but maybe they have no success in terms of a wider recognition, economic success, or other people's looking at it, valuing it, anything. And they value that work just as much, probably, that particular person. And then, at some point it ends up in a dumpster or something, right? It gets thrown out, and that whole life in a way. So I wanted to make a little bit of a monument to that idea of the other artists that don't get known in a way, but without being specific. It's not supposed to be any specific artist. It's not supposed to be my studio. There's elements in it that talk about a lot of different things. That view in particular is from a photograph my father took of his studio. Like I said, he was an artist. And it's from a view he took of his studio in the 50s in Brooklyn, and my father had died about 5 years before I made this piece. So there's a lot of processing of it slowly after 5 years that ends up in this piece for me. Whoever this artist whose studio this is kind of my father's generation, not quite my generation. This is a really old school studio. And my dad had taken all these pictures of artist studios for art magazines. So I had all this great material to look at of what kind of, turpentine cans Joan Mitchell had in her studio. There's like some drippy Pollock shoes down there at the bottom. Just kind of all this information, the idea that like as an artist, you have everything you need to make work. You have a space, a studio. You have tools, you have materials, you have inspiration in your books, you have history kind of behind you in all those books and stuff like that, and yet you're psychically you can't go forward even though you have everything materially that you need to do it. And this work was a huge left turn for me for what I was showing at the time, and I was a little nervous about it, but when I finally showed it, it was really well received, and I was so thrilled with that fact. It proved to me that I didn't have to be beholden to what I thought were others' expectations, right? That I could take a really hard left turn and do something as long as I really threw myself into it and I loved doing it, which I did, it would hopefully kind of work. And it proved to me that I liked the sense of it maybe perversely kind of going against what people expected to me, or the worst word would be the brand that I had before, something like that. So it made me really think that I wanted to continue kind of keeping myself on my toes more and more as I kind of, it's not a midlife crisis kind of work, but it's something about that, like you realize you got to slap yourself awake and not fall into some sort of complacent mode or something like that. I think that would be the positive way to look at it. So that's kind of the real money shot of the whole thing, of just the sense of that blank canvas kind of holding this narrative of kind of a slightly sad, pathetic, maybe even depressing narrative that's at the core of the piece. And yet that subject of someone not knowing what to make, that I could kind of theatricalize in this way, gave me the absolute information and menu of what to do for a year. I spent about a year making this thing. Every day I knew, go into the studio and make some of these things. It's so different from the way I would paint, which is so much more intuitive and improvisational, and I don't really know what I'm actually doing from moment to moment or day to day in a way. I'm just kind of letting the process pull me forward. And this one, I really had it laid out for me. I had my work cut out for me, and it's so funny that it's like the narrative of it is what someone who doesn't know what to do. So that contrast of the energy you felt walking into the piece, and then this narrative that I tried not to make too heavy, a kind of subtle narrative of someone not knowing what to work. I like that tension between those two things, and that kind of drove a lot of work as I went on. So I did some of these paperworks that were also kind of about this idea of, destruction as kind of being the creation of my work. So these images of destruction would be my creation. So I was thinking of them a little bit in a Brahmanic kind of that cycle of, how things get driven as a wheel in that way. And it's a kind of funny image of kind of this idea of the struggle of an artist or something like that. So these are all like watercolor inks on paper. That's probably about the actual size. They're getting pretty big. A lot of these images were also kind of heavily influenced by and kind of cribbed from this very particular era of Japanese prints from the Meiji era, where they were making all these kind of war propaganda prints. This is like 1910, when the imperial Japanese war machine is starting and was starting to invade neighboring Asian countries. A lot of this work, the original Japanese prints, are very propagandistic, kind of rather racist in a way against their Asian neighbors, but incredibly beautiful at the same time. And so that I would look at them and like think like, this is like kind of, about something rather evil in a way, but they're incredibly beautiful. And that tension again kind of really interested me. So I wanted to kind of take it and out of that kind of more global perspective that original work had, kind of boil it down to kind of a personal narrative of something, kind of the tension of something bad happening that could be presented in this very beautiful way somehow. And it felt kind of political to me about what was going on in the world, because that whole Japanese prints were kind of about this imperial hubris that had kind of started at that point, and we know what that ended up being with World War II and how terrible that went. And this was 2003, and we were like invading Iraq, and it felt like there was a lot of parallels to me about that kind of political hubris, that like, what could go wrong kind of feeling that was out there politically. So I felt like the only way I could deal with my feelings about the politics, rather than actually make the politics explicit in the work, was to kind of find some sort of parallels about kind of some sort of black humor feeling, which was the only way I felt like I could kind of empower myself politically, because in the wider world, I felt very unempowered politically with the Bush administration, what was going on. And that was the only way I could kind of find some way of thinking about it without being completely depressed, to kind of try and make it into something that was kind of, black and funny somehow. So, I mean, it's not clear in any of the work, I think, but it's like, this is what I was feeling at the time. I wanted to kind of get back to painting again, and the experience of having had that cardboard studio piece, but which, by the way, that was called Full Stop. So that's the piece that was mentioned earlier, that's in San Antonio now and will be in Knoxville. And so I wanted to get back to kind of making paintings with kind of knowing what I knew from that other experience, to kind of incorporate something in that. So I was building these out of cardboard and covering them with this kind of plastic stuff, and building all the stuff. So there are these elements like the bucket there and the paint cans before that are all made out of the same stuff. They're handmade by me in the same way that the paintings are made. And the paintings have this weird slump. They're kind of like, leaning into the wall. And there was a few things behind that. One is that I wanted to kind of explore that kind of fake quality that building them that way had, as a platform for trying to kind of then bring up the integrity off of that kind of fake, somewhat cynical platform, let's say. I was thinking about, like I said, being an older person, and the way that as a personifying these canvases as like people, they're kind of like a little tired and stooped in a way, the way when you're a 20-year-old, you're not, you're full of energy in a way. And so that kind of like lean kind of felt like a way of kind of making paintings more humanized and less perfect, like the way they feel like when they're in a gallery or something like that. And this was also, I was feeling the kind of weight of politically again, of all those years of George Bush. This was about 2007, 2008, and feeling like exhausted after that period. And so that kind of, I wanted to kind of put all those things into the sense of the work. And also that to bring the stuff, the architecture, the elements of the studio with the works, drag them back into the gallery situation, rather than have the works be kind of, mortuaried on the wall like paintings can be, cut the umbilical from the studio the way that usually happens. I wanted to kind of drag this stuff with it, physically almost, from the studio, and have them existing with those things so that they retain that kind of informal sense when we're making work. They're kind of lying around and there's no presentation to it almost. It's just kind of like they're as good as they can be in that informal sense. And the way that incidental color of that other stuff can kind of be kind of creeping into the painting. I like this sense that like the paint drip on that paint can, if that was a real paint can, that drip has no intention, right? But the drips on the painting, we think of those drips as completely different, right? That they're full of intention, that they're telegraphing something about, emotion or the history of painting or something like that. And then a paint drip on a paint can has none of that, but they look exactly the same, right? So I wanted to kind of put those together to kind of have them cross-talk to each other and kind of point fingers at each other, a little bit in mockery, definitely. Okay, so this is about 2007. Then I kind of, after the large project of that, I wanted to do some smaller, kind of more intimate things. So I started kind of cutting up all these book covers and kind of just doing these little intimate drawing things with half the book cover and half the end paper. So I'm taking the two covers and I'm flipping one against each other to kind of get that strong horizontal or vertical line, and kind of just seeing what I can make out of that. And they're much more kind of, intuitive, nonsensical, improvisational things compared to the last body of work, which definitely had a certain kind of conceptual framework, even though it didn't necessarily tell me what to do in the work, I'd say. And I've always done a lot of drawings on old book pages, so this is just a kind of example of kind of making a, I'd call it like a periodic table in a way of a painting. All these kind of base elemental, things that could kind of in a way be at least mentally shuffled into a work somehow. They're like puzzle pieces almost, or they're the kind of things that are so elemental that any of these shapes are almost like they're before they have to become something into the service of either abstraction or figuration. They're kind of like so elemental and root based that they don't even have to kind of be ascribed to either of those two decision-making things somehow. That's more of a detail of it. And also, it's just literally using the extra paint on my palette so as not to waste it. So like I'd, having a little bit of extra color, and I'd put it in any one of these things. So I started kind of deciding that I wanted to take that quality of those kind of hand-built, slumpy canvases and make it a little less theatrical. I felt like people misunderstood something about that work being kind of about some sort of trompe-l'oeil thing, and it really wasn't what I was after. So I started making these, I made a very kind of funky original canvas out of, I made it out of cardboard and plastic, and made a rubber mold and started casting these canvases. That's kind of a view of the back of them. And just starting, and then I would hang them on the wall and have them act like regular paintings, regular canvases. So they were they felt like they had some sort of weird stealth quality, a private knowledge that mostly I would know. Many people would, maybe if they saw them in a show, wouldn't even realize this. And they would have this kind of quality of, for me, of like always knowing that they are, I never said this before, that I was going to, almost like knowing that they're sinners in a way, that they're come from a place of kind of fakeness, and that they are kind of like if you have a stretch of canvas and you hang it on a wall and it's blank, it already feels like it's like 50% quality at that point, right? It's got this trajectory to it, this momentum of kind of becoming art before you've even touched the damn thing. And so I get frustrated when I see art that's about adding that 1% more, the 51, and make it 51%, and it's already unbalanced art, right? It's past 50%. So I wanted to kind of find some way of like squashing that idea of the 50% way down lower to the floor almost, to kind of make these things more base, as a way of kind of opening up a lot of ceiling height in a way for the painting, so that then my job was then to kind of take that situation that is potentially could be cynical or something like that, and try and invest my integrity into it like that. Now my job is to paint its way to, it's got to earn that integrity, right? It's got to earn that kind of quality or something like that, rather than start with the already the momentum in its favor somehow. So that's kind of how I thought about them. So that idea of them being fake wasn't clearly demonstrated to people as in as strong a way as the previous work was. So I didn't know how that would work really. It's like I feel like that I know that they are made out of like doubt, let's say. Like physically they're cast in doubt, although of course it's plastic, but like that they are they have, rather than the doubt be the kind of intellectual position of the painter, or like some sort of little black cloud hovering over Philip Guston's head or something like that, that I wanted it to be kind of actually physically rooted in the object and always there somehow. And that word doubt, I think I love that idea of doubt in painting, because it means, I don't think of it as a negative in the sense that it makes you want to give up. I think it's a positive in the sense that it makes you need to stay awake. And kind of stay on your toes, always reevaluate what you're doing. Your egos can take some lumps from that, definitely. But if you set things up where, painting is really kind of a bit of a consequence-free zone. I think it's not gonna kill you, like crossing the street in the middle, without looking both ways. That's like, you've got to take care of things in your life and be practical and, not get kicked out of your home, all that kind of stuff. I have 2 kids. I have to think of, being responsible in all that way. But when you're in the studio, you can, as long as you can find a way for your ego to handle it, you can spend, a month of making shit the whole time, and nothing, if it's between you and it, and you find a way to sustain that doesn't really hurt you, psychically or something like that, you can really just like let it ride like that for a long time. And then for me, then something positive will actually come out of that. I trust that I can go through long periods of that, not gratifying my ego, because eventually that will be the most positive way to make something new that I didn't think of. If I always try and do what I know I'm good at, I get pretty good paintings, but not really good ones for me that feel like sustainable as to keep going with them. If I make a pretty good painting like that, I almost feel like stopping there in a way. But if I keep finding ways to kind of pull the success out of defeat in a way, that is really exciting, and that makes me feel so much more fulfilled, really, even though there's long periods of kind of not enjoying it, let's say. But I think that I found a way to not let that bite my ego too bad, where I can kind of still keep showing up for all those times when it's not good. Because I really do have a more of a long-term sense that will be the best way to do things for me, sustainably. So these are about 2013 or so, I guess. So we're getting close. I think the imagery was kind of starting to think about this idea of Puridolia, which was I couldn't find the word for it for a long time. I knew what it was, but I didn't find the word until several years later, which is this idea of when we want to see images in abstract phenomenon. So it's like the idea when you see the bunny rabbit in the cloud, or even maybe Jesus appears in a burnt tortilla to people, and there was a tree that had Jesus appear in it near where I was going at Skowhegan, and I went, and it was really just where a limb had got cut off and there was some mold growing, but there were pilgrims coming from all sorts of places to see this, and it was really interesting to me to kind of, I had my belief system where I didn't see it, but, I understood that kind of desire to see any of those images is really a very rooted, important thing. And Puridolia is kind of thought of as this sense of how, as a image processing thing, to see faces and things is personally for us kind of the first thing that we see as an image, which is like when we're infants, your parents' eyes are the first thing that you see that starts acquiring some real meaning in a way, right? Everything else is just kind of phenomenon buzzing around. And also they think it's perhaps one of the first ways that we processed images evolutionarily in terms of how you had to kind of recognize the attitude of someone's face, whether, you were fight or flight in a way. So I like this sense of trying to kind of get things to kind of feel like these paintings were very abstract, and then they could kind of somehow just I like this idea that, a really good abstract painter, when you start making something and it's like two dots and a line, and then you suddenly step back and you say, oh my God, it's like two eyes and a mouth, that if you're a good abstract painter, you will paint that out as quickly as you can, or turn it upside down or something like that. And I wanted to be I wanted to be a kind of a bad abstract painter where I let that stuff happen, and it's like kind of play with that edge and see. Also, the most ridiculously impossible project would be is like, if you can make something kind of appear as a face, can you walk that back for anyone? And it's probably kind of impossible to unsee that face, right? But I like that as a kind of a impossible project to keep working on somehow. So I wanted them to feel like they could kind of satisfy certain things of abstraction and kind of somehow take on this persona quality, which was, something like I talked about those slump paintings as like paintings as more like people and less like paintings somehow. So these are all still on the cast plastic, not plaster. So I like this idea also of, plastic is the thing that permeates our life, and they're, in a way, on a small batch sense, they are kind of mass produced all out of the same mold, right? So they're all identically, you saw that picture of them lined up before. And then this was finally the time when I felt like I could use oil paint on top of plastic. I felt like I could justify it for myself as a kind of a fine art material, because it was kind of perverse to be on top of on top of plastic. Gonna whip through some of these. This one was here in San Francisco, right, Greg? Yep. My last show with Greg here. I think this one as well. So this is from my last show in New York City in May, and I'm really a collagist in the sense that I'm kind of like, I'm doing this very intuitive, loose, improvisational parts of my painting, and then I tend to kind of edit it by kind of, in a sense, cutting things around by kind of laying in grounds around it. so that it suddenly turns into something that wasn't there in the original intent of my hand or something like that. I didn't know that something like this was going to somehow almost describe an eye or something like that. And I like this kind of sense of kind of pulling it out of that to kind of suddenly snap it into something by the kind of cutting around it. So it has a lot of these kind of grounds and a lot of them have these kind of dots on them to kind of find some way of kind of holding the ground down. And I like how kind of wonky those dots are. They're all kind of like wobbling a little bit. There's some kind of like I paint on something and then I kind of blot it with bubble wrap there. That's what kind of some of that look is. And I started finally kind of painting on linen again. Well, not again, ever. First time ever, really. So I had spent about 5 or 6 years of doing those cast plastic paintings, and I wanted to make sure again that I wasn't just doing it because it was something that I did and just kind of perpetuating that. So I started realizing that these images are kind of powerful and bold and wet, and they never really needed that cast plastic. I actually liked the fact that they didn't ever quite kind of coincide or they didn't quite make sense together, but I like that kind of tension in the cast plastic thing. So, but anyway, I wanted to kind of make sure that the exception proves the rule, that I could kind of do them on other materials and also scale it up. So this is pretty big. This is like probably twice that size or something like that. And the show I have up that opens Thursday is all linen pieces. I want to just show you kind of a progression of how one of these works can kind of, this is all kind of some of the stages and how things can happen and how many paintings are underneath these things and how they get kind of turned around. Stuff gets kind of edited out. I'm using like a roller sometimes to just blank stuff out. So there's all these paintings, all sorts of different kind of paintings underneath these things. And that's the final painting. Whoops, let me go back. That's the painting that, so this is actually in the show in San Francisco. So I wanted to show that kind of the way my mind works, how kind of, I'm just kind of trying things. I really don't ever really want to know what I'm doing until it's left my hand in a way. And then I can kind of look at it and see what it is, find some way of responding to it. And I know that I am making decisions. It's not just accident, certainly. But I like the sense of kind of things happening and just kind of being able to recognize them and incorporate them. I think I just have one more to show. Yeah, so that's just the last painting. Okay, that's all I have to say, but I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has anything.